I don't think you get many points, to be blunt, calling in the regulators and asking the regulators where you're going to get growth from. That's just another government by another flavour. It's like asking a convention of traffic wardens to run the British Grand Prix.
Is it possible at all for this to become a country again that enjoys a 2.5% growth rate?
Yes.
How can it be done?
Look, I think...
Because you didn't hand over a country enjoying a 2.5% growth rate.
Everyone was a bit guilty of signing up to targets without having thought through the folly of a single point moment in time target that was a bit arbitrary.
It was a bit arbitrary and it was a folly and it was a Conservative Prime Minister who did it.
Well, it was consensus, in fairness, so it was, but
well,
it was...
I mean, that's no defence of madness, is it? How can you possibly ride enough horses to get over the line? Are you scared of Reform UK?
I'm not scared. I'm very focused.
Hello and welcome to the editor's interview with me, Christian May, here at City AM. My guest today is the Conservative Shadow Business Secretary, Andrew Griffith, who has enjoyed an illustrious career in the private sector prior to entering politics, had a good run in government, now finds himself in opposition and specifically finds himself here in the City AM studios. So Andrew, thank you very much for joining us here at City AM.
Pleasure. I'm a reader, I'm a fan. It's great to be here.
Well, you can come again. We've got a lot to talk about. Your brief as it stands now is of critical importance. It feels to me as if the only story in town has been, or should have been, business confidence and the economy, business conditions since, I would say, since the budget. But actually, I'm sure we'll come on to the fact that sentiment began to turn before the budget, given how relentlessly gloomy the government was on entering office. But we'll get to that. Let's just ease in a little bit, because my first question for you really is, as I mentioned in the introduction, you enjoyed a serious career in business prior to going into politics. Do you miss it?
Yeah, I miss it in some ways. I mean, I don't regret it. I was very lucky. I did have a great run in business. You don't always get to leave, on a high, as it were. And we did well for our shareholders, our employees, and the company was left in good stewardship. And then I was looking for something to do as a second career, if you like. And always believed in the values of public service. And if we're honest, by goodness me, we need more businessmen and women of all flavours and people from different walks of life in Westminster, because the challenges that whoever our rulers are, that they have to deal with are very significant. So, I miss some of the attributes of business. It's lovely to be here in your wonderful offices at the heart of the square mile in the city where so much great work is done. People come and create new organisations, put deals together, all of those wonderful things. And it's one of the sectors that we're formidably good at as a country. But no looking back. I've made a decision to go into government and public service. And as you say, there's a really big job of work to be done, even from our vantage as the official opposition to this government.
We'll come on to life in opposition, but I just want to pick up on London as a whole. London is two cities, the city of Westminster, the city of London. Where does your heart lie? The city, the square mile, or Westminster? They're very different worlds.
Well, can I be really honest? I mean, the intersection between those two is what interests me, and business, businesses across the country, small and large, the sort of the third leg of that. But it's that intersection where everything good happens. All of the problems in society, we're not going to solve how to give ourselves longer lives and better quality of healthcare without the benefit of the private sector. We're not going to be able to get the infrastructure that we need as a society without mobilising private capital. So I hope it doesn't sound trite, but it's the intersection that interests me. How do you make Westminster understand business and capital, make those work better? And sometimes the other way around. How do you explain to business, why politicians make the decisions they do? What are the things that hold them back? We probably...
there's an entire industry devoted to helping business understand Westminster. One of the things you've been quite critical about the current government is the lack of business experience around the cabinet table. And you might sort of pick apart different governments and say traditionally people who serve in Tory cabinets maybe have had a career in business first, perhaps to a greater extent than their Labour counterparts. How much of a problem do you really think that is?
Well, it's a real problem if they don't then listen. And I try and be ecumenical, and you should play the ball, not the man or woman. But what business have been telling me over this 7 or 8 months now that government has been in is that they're not listening, they're not course correcting when they make mistakes. So if you think particularly the national insurance rise, it really hits some sectors of the economy, hospitality, retail in particular, lots of part-time workers. The change in threshold is doing real damage. Now, a good government, a listening government, whether it's from their own internal knowledge, from their own background before politics, or even as professional politicians who haven't done anything outside, should be listening to business, trying to make some corrections. And yet here we are, just under 4 weeks from when that bites, £40 billion of tax hitting the economy. And I don't hear, you may, but I don't see any change of direction. The government's sort of, put blinkers full on and it's sailing straight ahead into the iceberg. I think that's where the difference really matters.
We'll come on to some of the government's particular policies. You mentioned national insurance. Obviously, there's the employment rights reform, and there are some other big issues for the business community. But just picking up on the extent to which the government has listened or not listened, sometimes I like to sort of play this little thought experiment. Whereas I think to myself, if somebody said to me before the election, here are a handful of policies that one of the major parties is going to do. They're going to push on a major deregulatory drive. They're going to push for growth above all else. They're going to haul in all of the bureaucrats and regulators and rip out the obstacles to economic activity. They're going to build another runway at Heathrow. They're going to go big on nuclear energy. Which party do you think is responsible for these policies? I might have said, sounds like a Tory party manifesto to me. Of course, none of those things were really in the Labour Party manifesto. Nevertheless, they are. I welcome them. They, if I think about what the government's doing, the things that excites me about the government are all longer-term initiatives. What do you think accounts for this huge gap between the government coming in and then suddenly, almost 6 months later, unveiling all of the things I just listed as their central agenda?
Well, first of all, words are cheap, so it is good that the government are talking about all of those things for sure, and by and large they enjoy our support when they do so, particularly on regulatory reform. You will know from my own work as former city minister, I was pushing very hard the duty of growth on regulators. At that point, their position was to oppose it. So fantastic that they're now going ahead and get the point on that. Look, I think they're probably, and I'm not a commentator, I'm a participant, I think they probably scared themselves a bit. We have seen that very significant downgrade to growth. More figures actually out from the British Chamber of Commerce recently, downgrading their expectations of growth. I think we'll see that from the OBR. The IFS has been calling that out. So I suspect that the government have come in, they certainly trash talked the economy when they didn't need to. The budget, the adverse, almost unanimous reaction from business has probably scared them a little bit. And now we are seeing them talk about growth. I don't think you get many points, to be blunt, calling in the regulators and asking the regulators where you're going to get growth from. That's just another government by another flavour. It's like asking a convention of traffic wardens to run the British Grand Prix, right? If you want to know how to grow the economy, it is business that grows the economy. It's business, risk takers, private capital. They're the people that hire. They're the people that make decisions to invest. And that's where you should be listening. I think there's a little bit of work to do there, but I'm trying to be as balanced as I can. And it's good that people are trying to tackle some of these long-seated issues. Big one holding us back. People talk about planning. There's this whole corpus of judicial review that just chills everything in government. It makes it interminably slow. It's why there are so many consultations. Now, a government of lawyers should be perfectly placed. We tried to reform it and did run into the sand a bit on that, and regrets one has many. But that would be a perfect thing for a government led by lawyers to pick up and actually, a bit like Nixon to China,
so
go really hard on reforming judicial review.
So you'll give your full support, the Tory party's full support to the current government's efforts to succeed where you failed. So all of these areas of planning reform.
Well, I prefer to think of carrying on things that were unfinished, Christian. But
I'm sure
if that's how you want to put it.
I think a lot of people would point to a number of areas in which the last government failed. And governments after about 14 years, of course, inevitably start to run into the sand, as you put it. But all these blockers on planning, etc. And I know the argument about Tory home counties and not wanting to build quite as enthusiastically as Angela Rayner, for example, who doesn't have to worry about so many constituencies in that that territory. I get those arguments. But there's no denying that the landscape that this government, forget what party they are, this government came in and looked around and said, well, we can't get anything done in this country. There now seems to be this extraordinary consensus that we can't get anything done in this country.
Hard to argue with that.
Well, it's hard to argue with that.
But it's also slow, it doesn't work for people.
You follow the logic.
And the state's pretty expensive.
Yeah, but to follow the logic, you have to say, well, who's been running the country for 14 years? How do you account for that?
The malaise, when we come on to specific things about, look, how do you get things done? Why are things so slow? Why is it not working for people? If we're being ecumenical, the malaise has gone on for decades. The increasing risk aversion of a large public sector, the proliferation of regulators. I think the government set up, they've talked about putting growth duties on regulators. They've talked about even changing some of the tone at the top of regulators. 100% on board with that, right? 100% supportive of that. However, at the same time, they've also set up about 50, at the last count, new regulators. There's another one coming next week, the regulator for fairer work or something. So, it is important to walk the walk as well as talk the talk, coming from business into Westminster. And I use this phrase a lot, but words are cheap. It is ultimately the actions, right? We got some good talk on planning reform. Goodness me, London needs to build. This is one of the great global cities, but the level of house building dwellings in this great capital city is paltry. It's just desultory, and that needs to change. That's where the homes that we most need should be. But as of now, all we've got are words. There isn't yet a planning reform bill, and it's again, not to be too partisan, but it's the Labour Mayor of London. He didn't need a new bill, didn't need legislation. He's got all the planning powers already, has had them for many years. Those are the things we need to crack.
So it's interesting to consider, a Labour government that traditionally or by instincts was probably more comfortable with spending more comfortable looking after public services, if you like, that comes into office at a time when the economy, the economy is not growing. The economy, you could argue, has been shrinking. Parts of it have been shrinking since the Labour budget last October. But the problem is bigger than that. And you talk about a malaise over decades. And I do appreciate, we can't have this conversation without being mindful of the pandemic and, hundreds of billions of pounds of cost associated with that, and the energy shocks and war, etc. But even, moving back prior to those events, you talk about a malaise that's set in. We are a country now that, what turns a bad day into a good day is if the growth forecasts are 1%, not 0.9%. Can we possibly be satisfied with that? How is it, is it possible at all for this to become a country again that enjoys a 2.5% growth rate?
Yes.
How can it be done?
Yes. Look, I think...
Because you didn't hand over a country enjoying a 2.5% growth rate.
No, and as I say, we handed over a country that was growing, not shrinking. We're now in a per capita recession. But I don't disagree with your basic premise. The big issue is, how do you get good, proper growth? How do we get our mojo back, if you like? I think that's particularly true of the City of London, a financial centre. You're not bluntly going to grow the UK economy anyway, unless you've got that big engine of growth here in London doing its job and allocating capital to businesses. And I think it's on a number of levels. I think you do need that real sea change amongst regulators. I don't want to go too back in the past, but the Blairite revolution did some good things. It brought people into sort of the wider orbit of government with arm's length regulators who had experience from other walks of life, including from business. But it also put them beyond democratic control and accountability, so that there were limitations on my ability as city minister to actually, really move the dial on the risk appetite of regulators. To get them fully on board with reforming some of the rules in City of London that had been holding us back, and the risk aversion that had been prevalent really since 2008. So one of the things we've got to do, and people like Kemi talk about rewiring, it sounds quite dull, but actually it's really important to get the wiring of how democratic government works and delivers for people, because when people get frustrated with governments, including the one that I was part of until last July, the frustration wasn't necessarily the policies. People wanted safer streets. They wanted us to control the borders. They definitely wanted more economic growth. They wanted more homes for their children and grandchildren. the issue wasn't that we were trying to do the wrong things by and large. The issue was that they didn't feel, in many cases rightly, that we were delivering. So it's a delivery issue as far as I'm concerned.
We'll come on.
And you need to change how governments operate and deliver.
Yeah, well, we will come on to what Kemi Badenoch's Tory party is all about. But before that, let's just stick on the issue of the regulators again. It's fascinating to me that it doesn't really matter which party it is, but it is particularly interesting that a Labour government has come in and said we are held back by the regulators and we need to get them out of the way. Somebody put it to me in the city the other day,
while still creating new ones.
Whilst creating new regulations. Fine. Somebody in the city put it to me the other day that, with the exception perhaps of some individuals at the top, nobody really goes to work in a regulator because they want to unleash growth and rip up red tape. So I think it's ambitious, to say the least, for the government to call regulators in and basically just say, be more growthy. If you want to rewrite the regulator's mandate, this is a job for an Act of Parliament, isn't it? The FCA's mandate, the CMA's mandate was set down. CMA came into existence under the last Conservative government. It was an Act of Parliament. If you want to open that up and change its remit, then do so and do it properly. Is it sufficient? Whether it's you doing it, or in your last job as city minister, or the current government simply saying to them, "Help us out. We want you to be a little bit more." If you want to change their remit, change their remit. Is that what you mean by a proper rewiring?
I think the restoring democratic accountability is important. So our elected ministers can choose to make more decisions, including decisions on personnel at the top, if that's an impedance. There is a piece about setting the right remits. Now, without getting too technical for your viewers, as you know, remit letters are often sent annually. They're certainly sent once every Parliament. So there's a lot that one can do without having to go all the way back to Parliament and passing primary legislation. There are remit letters for all of the financial regulators and for most of the economic regulators. So there's a lot that you can do. And you're right. It is absolutely clear, in my view, that it is politicians who need to take ownership and responsibility for doing that. But then the organisations need to get on board properly as well. And the leadership needs to either fully sign up to that or get out of the way. And you need the organisation to strive properly, not passively resist or just be caught by past momentum. And I understand what it's like to work in some of these organisations. You sometimes feel, understandably, you get whipped if anything goes wrong. And that's what drives that culture of risk aversion. We, the leaders, it's true of leadership in any organisation, need to accept that risk, need to own that risk so that the organisations can get on and do the things that we ask of them.
That seems to me the area that I'm not sure this government has fully thought through. And in their traditional sort of slightly formal way, the heads of the regulators are trying to make that point. I mean, the chairman of the FCA wrote in City AM not long ago, in quite candid terms, that he really wants government to understand what it is they're asking for here. If you want us to have a more of an interest or a bias towards risk, you need to appreciate what that might mean. And I think what they're basically saying was the next time Mrs. Miggins in Cardiff falls victim to a Facebook scam, don't come crying to us. But no, I'm sure they would dispute that that's the kind of regulation they're going to get rid of. But what they're talking about is saying, are you fully aware of what you're asking of us to do? There will be more failure, there will be more difficulty. If the upside is that there's more growth and more innovation, then we need to have that conversation. Do you think the country is participating in that conversation? Because it's a cultural mindset as much as it is a remit letter.
Yeah, there's a big cultural piece. I think the answer is you have to explain what those trade-offs are, right? Again, there's no use having lots of talented politicians in Westminster who never actually surface what the different trade-offs are. If you want more economic growth and you want people off welfare into work, do not pass a 225-page employment bill that will drive people to not take a chance on that next employee. If this, then that. Very, very clear. And that is the role of good leadership in any organisation, and it should be the role of good leadership from Westminster. Now, there's other bits. Every executive in an organisation daily makes those risk trade-offs. They don't all need an overly defensive mandate letter to sort of point, having the bottom drawer to point to. They do that as a natural activity. And one of the things that our regulators would benefit from is more practitioner voices. I was very, very keen, whenever making public appointments to regulatory bodies to bring in practitioners, because they find those trade-offs much more natural than if you've come up solely through a regulatory or a public service background. There can be a tendency for defensive regulation and if you can't get specific sign-off, then it's much better to not approve the next innovation, to not take a chance on a new product or a new market entrant, just in case you might get criticised later.
Okay. One area, before we come on to politics, one area that I think the wind is really moving is around the net zero debate, future energy debates. It's pretty flagship stuff for this government, or it's certainly flagship stuff for Ed Miliband. There seems to be all sorts of rumours as to the extent to which...
expensive flagship as well.
Rumours as to the extent to which he's still taking the cabinet with him on this journey. But we are beginning to see the market, individual firms and people really starting to make their own decisions about this in a way where the consensus was all, even just 3 or 4 years ago, was absolutely in this direction. Perhaps best seen in BP's great commitment to basically cease to be an oil and gas company. And we've also now seen them completely turn around on that and say, actually, I'm sorry, we're going to put an end to a lot of our investment in renewables, and we're going to refocus, like our rivals have started to do, on oil and gas again, because that's where, not just where the money is, but that's what needs to be achieved. And there are other ways in which we see that debate shift. We see a lot of banks have started to quietly, sometimes not so quietly, pull out of industry groups on sustainable finance, etc. I think you add all these things together, there does appear to be what the internet would refer to as a vibe shift. I'd be interested for your thoughts on the extent to which you see that in Westminster. It might be the sort of last holdout for enthusiasm in this direction. But do you detect that? Do you think that there is a sort of movement back from some of the earlier enthusiasm in this way? And if so, is it just economic reality?
Yeah, I do absolutely see that vibe shift or that pivot. And I think a number of things have happened. Obviously, the changing geopolitical situation has alerted people to, what actually extended supply chains look like and some of the trade-offs embedded within that. The very high cost we have in the developed world, the highest cost in the UK of industrial energy, electricity supply. That you cannot, we are deindustrializing as a consequence of that. And I think that has been seen as well, if you look at the impact on our competitiveness as a consequence. Frankly, others have not moved. So embedded in assumptions that prior generations of politicians had made were both the development of technology adoption curves, and I know even in my old Lake TV land, trying to exactly predict consumer adoption cycles of new technology, or the way in which technology would scale and the costs would reduce, is a bit of a mug's game, and everyone was a bit guilty of signing up to targets without having thought through the folly of a single point moment in time target that was a bit arbitrary.
It was a bit arbitrary, and it was a folly, and it was a Conservative Prime Minister who did it.
Well, it was consensus, in fairness, so it was. But
well,
it was,
that's no defence of madness, is it?
As I say, I'm not excusing myself either from the fact I wasn't there in Parliament when that happened. I'm not sure I would have, had the same foresight either, so full culpability. But it was certainly the case that everybody and other parties were egging the country, even at that point, to go even further and even faster. Now that is, if you like, there's a wedge there. The Conservative Party does not think it is wise to continually attack companies that are engaged in hydrocarbons today, but might be transitioning to other sources of energy in the future, or to turn our back on the North Sea with, I think, 3.3 billion pounds of barrels of extractable reserves right under our metaphorical feet at a time when we have both energy insecurity and high energy costs. So there is a diversion. I couldn't calibrate exactly where everyone is on that, but my party recognise, and within my brief, it's really important to me that as we come forward with strategies for business, as the government publishes its own industrial strategy, which keeps getting pushed back, but we're promised, that we absolutely recognise you've got to be competitive in energy costs, just as you have in other factors.
Speaking of being competitive, let's take a moment to consider the state of opinion polls across the country. It's it's really quite interesting to note the extent to which the Reform Party, Nigel Farage's party, or Reform UK, as they're called, is now quite often seen at the top of national opinion polls. And I know you're all, perfectly aware of kind of politicians' responses and answers about polls being a snapshot and only one poll matters and it's 4 years away, etc. How much does it weigh on your mind, though, and on the mind of your party and your party leadership and colleagues, that Reform UK is a real problem for you?
Look, I think it's not unhelpful. It's not unhealthy that politics is a competitive domain. People have put forward their ideas, their people, and what their vision of the country is. And it's not a huge surprise to me, Christian, that only really a few months after, an election where we were kicked out of government, the surprising factor, if you like, is that after only 7 or 8 months, this government is already deeply unpopular. They've turned a very low mandate at the last general election into a ceiling, not a floor. And people are therefore not immediately going back to option A and hunting around and seeing if there's another option C that maybe they should try as well.
C.
Now, the controllable, look, what can we do in that? What can I do? What do I worry about? Are we presenting a more united front? People don't vote for parties that are at war with themselves. So are we, as the Conservative Party, now united, all pulling together? I think we are. The story you're not able to write is of division within the Conservative Party. And can we, and it will take time, in my view, can we show that we are a credible opposition, which is sort of the position in our constitution where you audition to be a credible government? Now, a lot of that's, I won't say backroom stuff, but I'll be in Parliament with my colleagues fighting line by line for business on the Employment Rights Bill next week. We were doing that on some other bills earlier this week. You don't always see that. You definitely don't see that on sort of the 5-minute clip of PMQs. But that, if we do that systemically and well, is sort of our audition to say people didn't give us their trust last July, but as they look to where they want their country to be led going forward, they're willing to do so again and give us a hearing to the sort of ideas that we will formulate.
Is that the plan, to see off the electoral threat of Reform UK, to say we will just quietly, competently show ourselves and reveal ourselves to be a sensible choice again? Because that is a strategy. Another strategy that's talked about is coming to some form of accommodation with them. And the debates that I keep having or hearing or picking up on or overhearing around Tory circles is we need actually to re-find and re-energise the kind of Cameron Osborne southern kind of floating Lib Dem demographic, and others saying, are you mad? Look what Boris achieved in the Red Wall. This is where we need to go. How can you possibly ride enough horses to get over the line? Are you scared of Reform UK?
I'm not. No, I'm not scared. I'm very focused. We are very focused as a party on doing our best job.
So who's the coalition that gets you over the line?
Well,
who are the voters?
I don't want to be too glib, but look, at Sky there were only 2 forms of customer: existing customers and potential customers. And in what we'd all acknowledge is a more volatile political situation, where the UK faces some really real challenges. How do we pay for the fact we're all living longer? How do we pay for our expensive healthcare system where there are more wonderful things that we can treat to give people a good quality life? How do we pay for an increasing defence budget where the money over many years has been harvested and then refarmed into welfare and other things? These are really big. I don't think many people sit in particular boxes on the political spectrum. They just want answers. They want a competent government that's going to, above all else, grow the economy, because otherwise we are going to continue to slip down the GDP per capita league tables. We are not any longer, sadly, one of the top 20 countries in the world for GDP per capita. There are forecasts out there that say that per capita income is going to exceed that in Poland. Poland is going to exceed that in the UK. These are really, really big issues. So I think there's more than enough for us to be getting on with. The electorate will make their choice. I remember days when UKIP won national elections. I can just about remember the SDP, that were in their moment. They had a moment and they were riding very high. But none of those are controllable variables for Kemi Badenoch, for us as shadow cabinet members. The controllable variable, and there is a bit, it's not just doing it in the back office, it's coming out and putting ourselves under your scrutiny to explain what we're doing.
Can you see a position down the line where, however informally, the Conservative Party comes to some sort of accommodation with Reform UK with a view to a loose coalition after the next election?
I can see perfectly foreseeably a scenario where the government, notwithstanding good intentions, notwithstanding some of the things that are good that we might support them, nevertheless, because they haven't fully assimilated some of the things that held us back from what we were trying to do, for example, international laws, for example, holding us back, I can perfectly envisage a scenario, without being delusional, whereby we get back into office with a significant majority alone at the next election. That is, after all, sort of what reversed itself at the last election, a government elected in 2019 with one of the highest ever majorities, that then clearly turned into a very significant majority for another single party. So, I'm going to hold on to that idea. I'm not going to talk about other parties. I'm going to talk about ourselves. And if we have the right plans for the challenges that the economy and the country face, why wouldn't people vote for us?
All right, but I tell you, this conversation will have infuriated Reform UK because their position is that they should be the ones being asked, would they deign to come to an accommodation with the Conservatives? Would they allow you to come to an accommodation with them?
Well, as I say, look, it's a competitive domain. I don't go out of my way to criticise any other party. I'll criticise the government where I think they are doing something wrong because it's their hands on the wheel today. But our job is just to be the best that we can be. And you can't operate in a democracy and believe passionately that democracy is the best form of government and then say people shouldn't have other choices.
OK, we'll just have a quick chat about the Tory party and then we'll end with a quick look at the spring statement coming up. I hear and I read, occasionally I write all sorts about what Kemi Badenoch is doing. And this is your opportunity to tell us because I'm a little confused sometimes. The idea initially we heard was no policy announcements, take our time, rebuild the right to be heard, slowly build trust, maybe start talking about policy in a few years. But I put it to you that actually what your lot is facing is learning, for some people for the first time, how to do opposition and how to be in opposition. And some people would also say that by opposing policies, you are, by nature of the act, putting a policy position in your own pocket. So it's not really credible to say we're not going to start coming out with policies. But I'm interested in the idea, as Kemi has said, that she wants a very substantial battle of ideas. She wants to totally look again at what the state does, how it does it, how it's funded. So how's that process going?
Well, it's early days. I think the government's been in, 8 months now. This opposition sort of under Kemi's leadership has been about 4 months, so pretty early days, and lots to do. Look, I think you're right and you're wrong on policy, if you like. I mean, the first thing, my version of this is your principles, then you hang underneath those principles policies, big areas that matter to people, and then you've got more detailed plans and even the people to execute them underneath. And we're sort of still at the principles and policies layer. But I think it has been misheard if people thought that there was no policies and that there'd be this sort of period and then suddenly, Vatican-like smoke coming out and suddenly they'd all be there at once. I don't think that was ever said. And we do have some policies, as you're right. You have to have a view as to what you would do differently on, for example, things like the VAT on independent education. We're very clear we will reverse that. The family business death tax and the family farm death tax. Again, we have a clear policy within what we will be able to do that reverses that on day one of the next Conservative government. And you're right, there'll be other measures as we go and oppose specific things that the government are doing, and there'll be other things that we will support the government. I think mostly on foreign policy, not the disastrous Chagos Island deal, but on most areas of foreign policy, there's a cautious support for the government. I really hope they'll get in the room on trade, for example. So, long answer, but it's not as binary as no policy. What Kemi's done, I think, really well so far is clearly stabilise the ship, and coming off the back of, our biggest ever defeat, it seemed to me perfectly within the realm of contemplation that the remaining 121 of us would form an orderly firing squad and finish the job. And that hasn't happened. And Kemi has united, all of those leadership candidates that were willing to serve in a shadow cabinet, drawn different wings of the party together. We are working, I think, well. The story you're writing is about disunity. We're starting to discuss where we'll be on policy. We'll be starting the work of that policy formulation. And it'll be a little bit, I can see it'll be damned if you do, damned if you don't. If we sort of suddenly rushed out a whole slew of policies, people would say these guys haven't taken any time to reflect. They're not listening. Maybe those policies would get out of date anyway quite quickly before any election was in contemplation. So we're going to take our time. And some people will say, well, where is it? Come on.
Yeah, fair enough.
I want it all tomorrow.
But there is an election coming. How big a test are the local elections?
Look, all elections are a test, but they're low turnout. They're from a high base. So the last time these particular configuration of local councillors were contested, the party was in a very different place as I believe a post-COVID sort of bounce, which was a phenomenon at that time. So, I think you've got to contextualise everything rather than try and read too much into one particular set of elections.
I'm sure you would, yeah. Let's just end with a quick look at the Spring Statement. City AM readers, viewers, listeners will know we've kept a very close eye on the reality that the Chancellor is going to face at the Spring Statement. And indeed, it's no surprise that I consider a lot of the difficulty that she's going to find herself in to be of her own making. And not that I want consensus to break out between the two of us, but I dare say you would agree with that. But what are you going to be looking out for in particular? In the run-up to that, we've obviously got OBR forecasts to consider, and then the fiscal headroom debate and the consequential public spending or indeed tax rises to consider. How are you going to be approaching that?
Well, first of all, even going into that, it is not too late to change course on any of the measures that have got us where we are. So, businesses are frantic, actually, trying to balance the books and work out what they're going to do on headcount because of the national insurance rise that's just a month away. But a month's a long time in politics, and there's still chance for the Chancellor to change course or to offer some amelioration or mitigation of that. So when you are in a hole, stop digging. And yet, I would say that the government is still digging. They're still barrelling ahead with all of those changes, and they're aiding and abetting that with legislation like the Employment Rights Bill, which is hundreds of pages of extra red tape for employers that will chill our otherwise relatively flexible labour market. It's a bill that's got all sorts of things that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown never tried to relitigate. We've got a pretty decent balance, I think, between workers' rights, perfectly legitimate role of trade unions, but also what actually helps people into employment. So first thing between now and then, stop digging. See if you can reverse some of the measures you've already put in place that have crushed growth in the economy, and certainly shelve the Employment Rights Bill. Business would really welcome that. U-turns are, they're embarrassing for one day in politics, but that would make a huge difference to business confidence, to British businesses. I don't think there's a single business in this country that thinks the Employment Rights Bill is good for them or what they're doing. On the Spring Statement, the Chancellor needs to be very clear now that there is significant capacity to cut. The state spends, the less productive part of the economy spends approaching 1.5 trillion a year. It was always naive, and we said at the time that running that level of spend with only headroom of 9.9 billion, and others, the OBR themselves observed that was one of the lowest ever levels of headroom. So the Chancellor made her own fiscal rules, and now it looks like she's going to miss even the new ones that she made up. So a bit of self-awareness would be quite good from the Chancellor, that, bit of humility.
Do you think it's going to come down, that closing that headroom gap is going to come down to spending cuts, or do you think there's going to be some tax rises either now or in the autumn? And my second question on that is that this government will pursue, one assumes, any cuts to public spending with regret, or at very least sort of badged as a sort of reform, whereas you think, correct me if I'm wrong, just discerning a slightly kind of a different philosophical, ideological perspective, which is actually the state needs to shrink full stop. Never mind doing it in March because you need to hit your rules. Actually,
yeah,
we need more substantial
I'm a
cuts.
philosophical conservative, and for the United Kingdom to compete against other, fast-growing nations that are delivering better for their citizens, there is a point where you have to get back to the level of spend of the government and restore that back to the productive sector, whether it's removing burdens on business, fewer, maybe better regulators, or just having less dead weight in the rucksack as we try and run that global race. So I think, you can talk about growth and supply side reform, and governments are good at talking about what others should do, about what planners should do, for example. Government itself, could do a lot of supply side reform. It could have fewer people. It could make faster decisions. So I think that would be a good in all circumstances. Now, the fact is that I think that it's going to be forced upon the Chancellor. And had she been able to go after public spending cuts in the first place, you wouldn't have had to have big rises. The national insurance increase, it's 25 billion gross, but it actually only raises about 9 billion for the government after it's sort of round-tripped what it pays on its own employees. And so if you'd gone after cutting public spending in the first place, you wouldn't be in the mess that she's in now.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Andrew Griffith, Shadow Secretary of State for Business, thanks very much for joining us here at City AM.
Okay.